Hello, and welcome to Synthesized Sunsets. Our guest this week is Alexander Wales, a prominent author of rationalist fiction and one of its most active community members. He is most famous for writing Worth the Candle, an epic portal fantasy in which the protagonist finds himself trapped in a strange fantasy after the death of his best friend, a world that appears to be a strange amalgamation of every Dungeons & Dragons campaign they've ever played together. Wales has also written This Used to Be About Dungeons, a character-driven slice-of-life fic also inspired by D&D, The Metropolitan Man, a work of rational fan fiction focusing on Lex Luthor from Superman, and his most recent work, a portal fantasy called Thresholder. Alexander Wales, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so to get started here, I was wondering how you would define rational fiction as a genre. Like, what do you think are its most important characteristics?
Okay, so this is like a debate that we've had in the community. The subreddit r/rational was started around 2013 following Eliezer Yudkowsky's Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. And early on, most of it was just like people posting things that were very similar to that. The sort of like fanfic that is based on that. Over time, we've sort of grappled with this definition of like what it's like. For me, I usually will define it as like thinky fiction. It's fiction that rewards thought, that rewards people thinking about it, that the author has clearly spent a lot of time thinking about things and wants you to think about them too. It's sort of like inviting you to engage in it in that way. You're not supposed to like turn your brain off. You're supposed to turn your brain on.
Yeah, I think one big thing I always notice with rational fiction is there's oftentimes some sort of rule or something, and then characters will find a way to, I guess, sort of like exploit this rule or like take it to a kind of logical conclusion past what you might sort of like expect was like the given intent. One thing in your books, in both Worth the Candle and This Used to Be About Dungeons, there's like a ton of time spent with magic items,
Yeah.
which are really cool, where it's often like this magic item has like a kind of obvious intentional purpose, but then some other like, well, based on how it's set up, we can also get this
Yeah.
other way of using it.
I think this used to be about Dungeons has 10% of it is devoted to magic item identification and exploitation, and they get like a new magic item and does this thing, and they're like, oh, what are all the uses that we can have for that? Like, how can we like turn this into like a profitable money making business? Like, how can we use this for our hobbies and things like that? There's a magic item in Worth the Candle that's like one of my favorites. It's the hair axe, and it's the axe where if you cut someone with it, their hair grows by like an inch or whatever. And it's just like, okay, you could definitely make a business out of that. You can like sell that to a barber and just does like minor superficial cuts to like grow someone's hair out and things like that. And that's the kind of thing that I like a lot. That's sort of characteristic rational fiction to me. The Munchkinry aspects, I think a lot of people really enjoy that more broadly, and I think for us in the like community, it's important to try to not cheat that as much as possible, because there can be a thing that you do where you set up the system and then you have an exploit to it, and it just sort of works because of fiat. It works because the author decided it was going to work that way, and you want to have the grounding and the rules and have this be like actually clever. And in other fiction, I guess I will say in a more moderate way, like authors do not care as much about that. That they don't. It's more about the aesthetics of Munchkinry than the like sort of reality of it, I guess.
Yeah, do you feel like when writing this, do you often like write an idea for like this is the magic item, and then 20 chapters later you come up with a potential exploit and then write it in as the character like
Yeah,
coming up with it as well?
yeah, and that is like I really enjoy writing. I'm one of those writers who this like would be my hobby, even if I weren't, you know, making money off it or whatever. Um, and I love that moment of like problem solving that comes in writing when you're like, oh, I have an actually good idea. I've solved something that was like happening in the narrative. I have taken these little puzzle pieces and built something cool with it. That's sort of what I'm in the writing for.
I know, like Wildbow, the author of Worm, this superhero web fiction, has written about solving problems in the text like as they're happening, kind of like
Yeah.
what Gordon was describing. Would you say this is a prominent characteristic of rational fiction writers, or not particularly? This is just kind of a thing in writing in general.
I think it's a thing in writing in general. I think for rational fic, sometimes I do have a plan for it, and it's like I know ahead of time like what I'm setting up. I think there are two ways to write, and it's a lot better if you like find it in the moment and it just like works really well. Like that's a much better feeling. But I think when you're a writer, you have to do more planning than that to if you want to do it well. Yeah, I read Worm. I'm a fan of Wild Bow. I was reading it sort of as it came out, and there's a lot of that in it, which I really appreciate the problem solving aspects of it. But I think you can plan it out ahead of time. You just need to do a lot of planning, and it's make sure that you're not cheating it too much.
We wanted to talk a little bit about Worth the Candle, since that's the work that
Yeah.
you are most famous for. I will confess that I've not read Worth the Candle, although many of my friends have. But I did take a look at the like the webtoon actually a little bit.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like what has the progression of Worth the Candle been like? Like how did it go from idea to story and now like webtoon?
Yeah. So let me see. I had been writing a web serial called Glimwarden, and that made it to like 13 chapters. I was doing like chapter a week. I was just getting super stressed out about it. I had made what I felt at the time was like a major structural mistake. And I was like, man, I have to like fix this and do this course correction and stuff. I was just getting like anxious and stressed out about it. And eventually I was just like, all right, I'm not going to write this anymore. I am going to, just take a break and figure something else out. So I started writing Worth the Candle under pseudonym because I was just like, I need a like low pressure thing that I can just like put out words, not be like super worried about how people are feeling about that. The genesis of it was when I was 18 years old. One of my best friends died in a car accident, and I was like wrecked about that. And that's like thematically one of the cores of what Worth the Candle is. This is revealed in like fairly early on in like book one, where the protagonist Juniper is like, "Yeah, my friend died, and I need to tell you about this." It's like there's like the background to understanding me and who I am. But I was like 30 years old when I started it. I was still very like would have these moments of like depression about that, and I was like, okay, I'm just gonna like write a thing that is about that, and then about like 50 other things. This like hyper maximalist world building. There's like 27 different magic systems in Worth the Candle. There's like 200 different like species of people. I just was like, I'm gonna cram everything into this, and it's gonna be about like building things and creating worlds, and it's also gonna be about death. And that was sort of how that started. I published the first book, which is like 60,000 words, in I think 22 days, which is like very fast. I was just like cranking it out, and I was surprised that it got as much traction as it did because it was very weird in a lot of ways. It's like normal in some ways, and then weird in other ways. And I was mostly just writing for myself. I think it was about 2 years in where people kept asking me about like Patreon, and I had this like other identity that was like in I was like the moderator on r/rational, and I was like in all these discords, and people were talking about this thing that I was writing, and I was like, well, I gotta eventually merge these identities back together. That's there's some like ethical considerations there, and but yeah, so I eventually it took about 4 years for me to finish Worth the Candle, um, and it's about as long as Worm is. It's I think slightly longer if you include the epilogues. Yeah, it's been I've really enjoyed that people have like liked it a lot. We got like an audiobook deal. The next book for that is coming out on It's like end of July, I think. I don't have the date for that, and it has the webtoon, and people keep asking for like physical books, and I'm just like, okay, it's a very personal book, and I'm glad that people identify with it, even though it's has my fingerprints all over it. It has all these like autobiographical things that I did not think when I was writing it would necessarily resonate with people.
Yeah, one thing I was wondering is, obviously in world like the world of Arab is like very based off of Juniper's D&D campaigns and stuff. To what extent is it like based off of D&D campaigns like you ran as a teenager and stuff?
It's actually a lot less than I think people usually assume. I would say maybe 20 or 30%. Most of it was just created straight for Worth the Candle. There, I think there's an index in one of the chapters. I have like notes chapters where it's just like, here's background details and stuff. And Juniper gives a list of every campaign that he ran. And it was like 1 in 5 of those was an actual real thing, and everything else was made up for the book. There's a world building document, which is like almost 100,000 words, I think. And there's an exclusions document, which is like places that have where magic has gone haywire, and that's like another 100,000 words. But both of those were like almost entirely done from scratch.
Mhm.
It's just better for the story to have like very specific thematic reasons for these things to exist.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's definitely differences in like kind of what you need out of a world for a D and
Yeah.
d campaign versus a story of fiction. I know I originally started like reading Worth the Candle in say either 2017, 2018 is like one of the very first web
Yeah.
fictions I did. Yeah, and I think it was like it was definitely not done at that point. I think it was still relatively new. I'm not sure exactly when it started, maybe 2016, 2017 around somewhere,
Yep.
right? Um yeah, but then I stopped reading it at some point. But then I would just recently like read the first few books. And in that time in 2018, I started playing D&D, and I've played every week for the past 6 years. And I feel like the book like just hit me so much harder, and I got a lot more out of it. And there were so many like little nods and stuff that I kind of missed the first time around on these
Yeah. I've
sections.
also heard that a lot of dungeon masters like it because there's like stuff they can take from it and ideas that
Mhm.
are like there to steal that I've sort of like left as like, hey, this is my fun idea. I want you to have this fun idea and just put it in your game. So,
Do people ever send you like their D&D campaigns that have used some of your ideas?
yeah, I've read some people have run explicitly like this is my Worth the Candle game that I'm running, and that's like based off of Worth the Candle, and so it's meant to be the same like world and have some of the same characters and some of the same narrative beats and stuff. People I've seen I think about 3 of those, and then I do get a lot of people saying like, yeah, I took the idea of exclusion zones, or I took the whatever idea, and I put it in my game, which I always find really fun.
Yeah, do you think being a DM is good preparation for being an author, writing a work of fiction? Because
Um,
a lot of skills carry over and not too much.
I think it sort of depends on how you DM. I think there's like sort of a freewheeling improvisational style that is one of the ways that you can write. There are different ways of being a writer, I guess I would say. I took a lot from being a DM and brought it to writing, but I was a very particular type of dungeon master where I was always doing the problem solving thing, always like paying attention to where the characters wanted to draw the story, always trying to like put a structure down on top of the characters so that
Mhm.
if people decide they didn't want to do the main quest that I'd set up for them, I would say, "Oh, okay, like what you don't ask them necessarily what main quest they want to do, but you want to make it feel at the end of campaign that you would plan the whole thing from the start."
Mhm.
Um, I think that's an extremely good skill to have as an author. But other authors write in different ways where they plot and they plan everything out. I try to do that as much as I can. I just sometimes will look at my outline that I wrote at the start of a story and I'll look at how the story actually went and I'll be like, okay, we went off the rails, and part of D&D is and being a dungeon master is you have to be okay with going off the rails.
Yeah. It's got to be comforting to be like, like look at yourself off the train tracks and be like, okay, I've been here plenty of times before. Where it's like, I imagine if you're an author who's just writing a first novel, never having DM before or something, like that might be like very alarming.
Yeah, and I talked to a lot of authors, and some of them are just like, yeah, I just got stuck because something unexpected happened and it wasn't working. I think that a lot of authors get too precious about it, and they don't leave room for mistakes, or they just don't have the ability to adapt and improvise. So
You wrote an essay talking about how to write web serials, and there's this one section where you were talking about writing yourself a way to have an out for various lines in case it doesn't work out. I'm wondering if being a DM is actually more has more overlap skill wise than like as being like a web serial author as opposed to being a conventional author because
oh
like
yeah.
sometimes you
Uh,
really need an out. Like
yeah,
things can kind of evolve in a way you don't expect.
yeah. Being a web serial author is very different from being like a traditionally published author because you don't really have the capacity to go back and like change things. You have a little bit. You can go back and you can fudge some stuff, but like by the time you're writing, chapter 10, everyone's already read chapter 5. They probably are, unless you like ask them really really nicely, they probably are not going to like read a different version of chapter 5 if that's what you post up. So you are when you're writing serial, you're stuck with what happened in the past, and you need to be able to adapt to it and just be like, okay, I'm gonna like shift the story into this new groove, and that thing that happened earlier that was just like a weirdness that happened. Like that's in the extreme case, I guess, but that does happen a lot where you have to switch tracks and try to find your way out of a mess you've made. And it's a lot better if you have left yourself an out.
Yeah, I feel like I'm a pretty egregious reader of web serials here, and that I don't think I've ever got, even though I've seen that type of comment, like, oh, I rewrote this thing because it was bad for some reason. I don't know if I've ever gone back and actually reread. And furthermore, honestly, if an author is like, well, like, I changed this because to make it change in that way, I'm kind of like, I was already in my head. I'm like, it was already the previous way. That's what I'm going with in my head, and that's kind of what it's going to be for me. But yeah, I feel like that kind of sucks as the author having to deal with people like me.
And I think it's just you have to be aware of it. You have to sort of know that readers are not going to go back and like reread a rewritten chapter. And there's something freeing in that you just know that you're going ahead, you're not looking back very much. You need to know what you said in the past and what the readers expect, but not being able to change the past means that you don't end up tinkering with things a lot. I met a guy who it took him like 7 years to write a novel, and he had just been going back through that thing and writing new chapters and taking chapters out. And I didn't think very much of the book. It was a fine book, but I was like, you could have written a better, like, you could have written two good books in the time that it took you to write one good book if you had, like, not just spent this endless time. I just don't think you get that much out of going back over something over and over and over and trying to polish it in different ways. I also
Yeah,
think that a lot of authors don't have the like distance that they need to do that effectively.
Mhm.
yeah. I mean, it's also like your second book is probably going to be better than your first book anyway.
Hopefully,
Yeah, hopefully. So it's probably good to finish the first one at some point.
yeah,
Um,
I mean, it's interesting because there are some ways in which you're getting reps by like editing and revising your work,
yeah,
but you haven't gotten any of the most important reps, which is the rep of writing an actual book.
yeah,
And so, like, yeah, I think that's the most important rep of all. And if you don't do that a couple times, then I think there's a pretty hard ceiling on how much you can improve.
yeah. This one of the things that I say to people a lot is it's really easy to get good at writing beginnings, and it's hard to get good at writing endings. You can start like 50 novels super easy, and like you're only gonna write the end of a novel. I don't know, in your whole life if you write a lot, like 20, 50 times maybe. So
I've been like honestly, I mean, I know a lot of people have the opposite experience, but when I was younger, the main thing that I read on the internet was webcomics, and webcomics would never finish, like ever,
Yeah.
ever. I've probably read like three webcomics or something that have finished, and so reading web serials, I've been pleasantly surprised to just be like, oh, sometimes these actually end. Like that's pretty cool. And it's not even just that the webcomics wouldn't finish, but like they wouldn't finish at a pretty early stage in their development. Yeah, I think it was pretty common for a web comic to just end a third of the way through, and so that was kind of a nice adjustment. I was also wondering, like, do you think that there are some ways in which the modern web serial economy is better at holding writers accountable for finishing, or do you think it's more that writing web comics is just like way more manually intensive as like a creator?
I guess my feeling is that I do expect a lot of web fiction authors to have a very, very strong incentive to never end. If you end a web serial, all those people are not necessarily going to go read your next thing, you know? You, especially if it's not very similar to the thing that came before. So I finished Worth the Candle and I started pretty much immediately on This Used to Be About Dungeons. And I knew going into that there'd be a bunch of people who were like, "Oh, I don't really want to read like a slice of life dungeon crawl type thing." There were a lot of people who wanted me to immediately write like Worth the Candle too. So I think that part of what happens with webcomics is there's just this like profit motive that like really really incentivizes people to keep going, and then that's a hard thing to do with a story. There's actually one of the themes of many in Worth the Candle is this idea of degenerate cycles of like you do the narrative and you do the narrative and it loops and it keeps going, and eventually like where do you end up? Like where do you end up when you're like 50 books into your series? Like, you have to like reset things, you have to bring new characters in. I do think that you see that in some web fiction. I will not name names, but there's some extremely long series that I have not necessarily read where I'm like, okay, uh, I see your word count and I'm skeptical about what is happening narratively. And I do not have the time to read like 3 million words to just understand how you were doing this in like a structural way. I do also think a lot of I don't know. I believe strongly in finishing a web serial. Um, Glimworn aside, I will come back to Glimworn at someday. It's a black mark on my record, but I'm on book 5 of Thresholder, and when that is done, uh, it'll Thresholder will be done. It will have told a complete story to the best of my ability, and it'll be like a million words. This used to be about dungeons. Is like another million words, and it is important to me to like have an ending that is like, okay, I said the things that I wanted to say here. Maybe I didn't explore the entire space, but it's something that I value very highly in books is an ending. Uh,
Yeah, I definitely feel like I don't know, it's quite common. I'll read a web serial. I feel like there's a point where I can almost tell like the author is consciously like, okay, I'm starting to make money. I quit my job. This could be a career, and I am not going to advance the plot. We're gonna keep the middle section of this book going longer. I mean, not like not advance the plot at all, but it is kind of yeah, I mean, because as you said, it's such a big gamble to just end a book versus just kind of keep it going. Even if like the quality maybe decreases a bit, it's like if you have a fan base
yeah.
and readers, yeah.
I was wondering like if it's ever well, I guess you wouldn't know this, but you were talking about the whole pseudonym thing. I was wondering if any web serial authors will actually like use a pseudonym to escape the confines of the fic that they're not allowed to end. Just like
Yeah.
start writing. Because if you wrote under your same name, people would just kind of be like, "Why aren't you working on Worth the Candle?"
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
if you did some other pseudonym like Cthulhu XCX or something,
Yeah.
and you were just writing on like some other fiction, like maybe then that could be a way you could, I'm just wondering if that's like everything that's done.
I think that it must be. I think a lot of writers, you get into it for love of the game, right? You get into it because you just like love the process of writing. I love the process of writing. Uh, it is very hard to tell people I don't actually like this thing that I wrote. I don't want to write it anymore. You're not getting an ending, right? That is, I think that's something that authors feel, that they just like they don't like this thing anymore for whatever reason. I think you work on something for like 2 years, 3 years, you're just sort of like, that's a long time to spend in that one headspace. And for a reader, a reader can read that in like 2 or 3 weeks. I have people come up to me and give pretty short timelines for how long it took them to read Worth the Candle, and some of them I'm a little skeptical of. But yeah, if you said, "Oh, I like didn't do anything for a month, and this was my sole hobby was reading your book," and I'm like, well, okay. For me, I was reading it reading and writing and having it in my head for 4 entire years. There was not a week that went by where I was just like, all right, I'm not doing any of this. It was just sort of constantly in my brain. So yeah, I think there must be authors that sort of escape to go write something else. There's a very common way for webfic to sort of peter out, where there'll be increasingly longer gaps between uploads, and then they'll say, "Oh, like I think I'm back in the groove of things," and then like it's like, "Oh, last updated like 2 years ago," you know. Uh, and those authors must be going off to do other things. I don't think that you just like stop writing entirely. That's not my model for how most authors are, especially web fiction, where it's not really about the money when you start anyway. You don't have this idea that like this is my path to success. You have the idea people might like this, or sometimes not even that. Sometimes it's just like this is an idea I had to get out of me, and I was writing it for myself, and maybe you like it, maybe you don't.
I've heard that like actual published authors do this.
Oh yeah,
I went to a talk by this book editor of speculative fiction novels, and she was talking about how there was this one time where I think she was on like AO3 or something, and she was reading some author profile, and she's like, this writing seems really familiar. Like it really seems like one of my authors. And she basically came to the conclusion that this was, in fact, one of the authors that she was currently working with. But I mean,
yeah,
she didn't want to like contact them to expose them or whatever. It was just like, like I do, just like in the depths of AO3. I think that idea is like kind of fun.
yeah. There's also a way in which, if you're writing under pseudonym, it is nice to get like a more authentic reaction that is not like burdened by anything you wrote before. That you know, you're not worried like, oh, I like people are just coming in and they're liking this for other reasons than the writing itself. They have these ideas about like who I am or what I write or something like that. That was the thing that I enjoyed with that like early year or two of Worth the Candle, where there are people who liked my stuff and it wasn't tied to anything that I'd written before, and I was just like, okay, it was not a fluke that I wrote something that people liked. I have done it, twice now. I've built the reputation twice, and I don't have anything to prove to myself or anyone else now. Um, I don't know. It's very a lot of that anxiety that I talked about with Glimborn. Some of that was just like I gotta like live up to. There's when you're writing a ratchet effect where you're like, I need to make everything better than the last thing, and a lot of people will stop writing because of that. They'll just be like their standards for themselves just get way too high, and there's too much stress and pressure that comes with it. And a pseudonym is wonderful for helping with that.
Yeah, makes sense. Shane Lane's a bit. I want to talk about this used to be about dungeons. So this used to be about dungeons is like my favorite one of your books. I really liked this book a lot. And I thought it was pretty unique in that it was like I feel like it was both kind of rationalist and like a slice of life, obviously. And I
Yeah,
thought these actually fit together quite well, in my opinion, because there's a lot of like these normal slice of life tasks of like I don't know baking or cooking together or going shopping together, but then you also have these tasks like planning through every possibility that could happen in entering this dungeon or like doing exhaustively testing all of these magic items, and these are all also kind of chill tasks that you can have your characters just like hanging out doing and be still focused on these interpersonal relationships. But I feel like this is not really something I've seen before. I mean, mainly probably because I think in general, the people who read slice of life and the people who read like rationalist fiction are not the same people. But yeah, I was wondering if that was something you felt at all while like writing it, or like something you did on purpose.
Yeah, I think it's a unique book in a couple of ways. It is slice of life without. I had not like read a bunch of slice of life before writing it. I was just like, okay, I understand the concept of slice of life. I understand what appeals to me about what I understand this concept is, and I just did not do very much like I guess I'd call it market research or anything like that. I was just like, I want to write my own version of this that appeals to me and is like not necessarily what everyone else is doing with it because I don't really know what they're doing with it. I really enjoyed This Used to Be About Dungeons when I was writing it because there's so much character work in it. There's like, I was one of the things I was really focusing on was trying to give everyone sort of a unique voice. There's a writer test that you can do where you cover up all the names in a scene and you should still be able to tell who said every line. And I was like, I really would like to have the ability to do that as a writer. And it's like, okay, that's like one of the things that I'm gonna aim for. Um, but specifically, like there are certain cases where it's just like people working on a problem and there's something beautiful about that. One of the early ones, they have to like move this wardrobe. It's like a magical wardrobe, and it is just like big and heavy. And they're like, well, how are we going to get this back home? Like what, like what is the process of returning this home? And they just like spend a chapter on lugging this big stupid wardrobe back to a place where they can get it, you know, to their home and stuff. And I just really enjoy the extremely low stakes of that. Is very different from a lot of rationalist fiction is about the end of the world or control of the world or super intelligences and here you have these characters are just carrying a wardrobe and like trying to like not break it. So
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I do feel like helping my friend like move a couch like into a new apartment is just like some of the just like most intellectually exhausting. Like, okay, we gotta go like this
yeah,
and like this and then do
Aw.
this. Yeah. Yeah, it is kind of crazy how different Worth the Candle and This Used to Be at Dungeons were in terms of tone. Like Worth the Candle was in general is like very dark, heavy book, and This Used to Be at Dungeons was like one of kind of the most feel good books I've ever read.
yeah,
And it's very just like they're all hanging out and stuff. One thing I really liked about the characters in This Used to Be at Dungeons is at least like as they're introduced, I thought they were like sort of believably unlikable, I guess. Like they all had flaws and stuff. I feel like oftentimes you have like this gathering of like your party and stuff, and all the people are like all cool in their unique ways, and it's just like, man, I do not believe that these people did not have friends.
yeah,
I don't buy it. Where this it was like, yeah, you could kind of see how these people like might rub some people the wrong way. And like as a reader, you like grow to love them over time, but there's enough friction to make interpersonal conflicts actually be believable. And yeah, that was really cool.
yeah. That was one of the pieces of feedback I got from people who are really into slice of life stuff, is that they did not like that stuff. They did not like that on initial meeting, and maybe even a little bit after that, there's like some missteps in how they communicate with each other or how they understand each other. There's a scene very early on where I think this is like only obvious in retrospect, but like Mizuki invites Verity back to her house, and Verity is like, "Is she like coming on to me? Is this like
Hmm.
what are we like? Are we accelerating like towards something?" And they're sort of like talking past each other and have like mixed expectations. And the slice of life people are much more. They want everyone to like be instant found family, instant friends, and so I got that feedback a number of times, and I'm just like, well, that's not the story that I wanted to write. I wanted to write people who, yeah, like maybe there are things that are a little obnoxious and that you want in small doses. Like Mizuki, especially, I think, has this gremlin quality to her that you're like, okay, I could see how she would get annoying, and I want characters that are have that sort of textured psychological realism to them. And yeah, the tone it being much different was, I got done with Worth the Candle, and I was just like, it was like 4 years of that, and I just wanted something different. I wanted something that was like a palate cleanser for me, and was do a bunch of things that I could not do within the framework of Worth the Candle, and I mean, it succeeded a lot in that sense. I do think that there are a lot of people who read Worth the Candle, and then they were just like, "Oh, you wrote like a slice of life thing. I'm not interested," and that is fine. I'm fine if people don't read the books. It is just like, I mean, I do think that if you liked them, I think that you would like both of them. I guess. I think
Yeah,
if you,
yeah. They're different in terms of tone, but I mean, they obviously have a lot of similarities
yeah, yeah.
stylistically and stuff, and characters, and uh, yeah, uh, yeah. I think one thing you run into is if you have that like found family thing happen instantly, like it can be very feel good at the start, but then I feel like as the story progresses, like I don't know. I feel like I've read stuff where it's just like any sort of like interpersonal conflict just feels so manufactured. Like it'll be like one misunderstanding and then like both the people like giving their I I don't know, where it's like if you have like some basis of like, okay, this character has this like sort of flaw or just like thing that people could find annoying, then any sort of conflict that arises can just like be written more naturally and flow
Yeah.
much better. Yeah.
I think that there's a particular way that writers can be conflict averse, where they have to have everything be a misunderstanding. They don't want it to be about a difference in values or a difference in personality, because that's harder to resolve, and it's harder to like there's actual meat there. Whereas with a misunderstanding, eventually you get to the point where like, oh no, you misunderstood, and then the other character's like, oh okay, we didn't actually have a conflict. We had a misunderstanding. We had like this fake conflict. I also think that those can work fairly well, but I don't enjoy them very much when writing.
Yeah.
How do you how do you go about creating these characters that have these very different like personality sets and values? Would you say it's more common for you to kind of like piece together traits from people that you know in real life or traits from people that you've read about in fiction, or do they just kind of like spring fully formed into your head somehow?
I tend to draw on people that I know. I also have been a writer for long enough that every time I'm talking to someone, I'm thinking, oh, like I could use this. Where I will like poach character traits, or I'll read sometimes I'll be reading a story and there'll be something that jumps out to me as just, like really compelling, and then I write it down in my collection of ideas. For this used to be about dungeons, I was very deliberate about it, and I think at the root of it is everyone needs to have sort of core beliefs and be like slightly different in those core beliefs and how they are like motivated. They have to have like different strategies for how they approach problems or how they approach people. A lot of Mizuki was taken from my wife. She that like specific aspects of my wife's personality. A lot of Alfric and Verity are taken from me. Like Alfric's described often as a brick, and I think there's a way in which I have this analytical mindset that can make it seem as though I am not having emotions. And I was like, yeah, that's like an interesting character thing. And like, Alfric's a good guy. People like him, but also you can see in the way in which that would like rub people the wrong way, right?
Mhm.
When it feels like everything is done on the analytical level, and it's like all business. I thought that was an interesting thing to explore. So I'm sure some of that was like subconscious while I was writing. People have their perceptions of you, especially if you're um, online and they can't see your face. They don't know. I've been told that I write as though I'm growling when I do like Discord. I tried adding some exclamation marks, and that just made it worse. So yeah, I think mostly I try to put pieces of myself and the people I know really well into the characters and make sure that they're different in that way. And when I'm starting out, I know my core characters and I want to have some understanding of their dynamic and how they're going to bounce off against each other, and sort of the way that they will have petty conflicts, I guess. They're both wanting to solve a problem. And they agree that it's a problem. They can still clash because they have different like styles and different approaches and different expectations for how each other will be.
Yeah, so one thing that I also liked about this used to be about dungeons is I think the time travel was really cool, like the chronomancers, and this used to be about dungeons.
Yeah.
Because most of the time when I read a book in time travel, even if it's like done very well, it ends up just like being so overpowered because time travel is kind of inherently overpowered that it completely warps the narrative around it at all times. Where Chronomancer is obviously still quite important to the narrative and powerful, but I feel like you put like a lot of limitations on them that were really satisfying to read. Like in particular, I really liked that due to there being like a lot of them and sort of like the priority system, that someone could kind of go through the day assuming they were going to reset it, but then it's actually like someone else's day that they're resetting, and they can kind of like learn all of your secret plans and whatnot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. How'd you come up with the idea for Chronomancers? Do you like often get annoyed by time travel tropes and stuff, or?
I love time travel. It is one of my favorite like things in fiction. I think I wanted a really soft, like a really underpowered time loop, right? I have
Yeah.
a blog post. It's like interesting things to do with time loops, and just sort of exploring this concept and all these different levers that you can shift. And um, the Chrononauts are like uh, a 1 day time loop, and you can decide whether or not to loop, and that's sort of like the base idea that everything else was scaffolded on top of. And the priority system is like a consequence of, well, you could go infinite without it, right?
Mhm.
If people could like if I reset before you and you reset before me, and then like we don't have a knowledge of how who has how many loops, eventually this has to like shake out in the end and have like an actual reality. You know, a single. There needs to be something that happens that day. It can't just like lock up in infinite
Yeah.
time resetting. There is a essay that Sam Hughes is QNTM. He wrote Fine Structure,
Mhm.
Raw, and Antimetics Division. He has an essay on time travel. He's a fellow like writer who's a hardcore time travel fan like me, and he had an essay talking about how whatever time travel system you have is going to need to serve the needs of the story, and it is going to warp the story at least a little bit, but you want to be able to like say something within that. So yeah, it's super important as far as plotting goes that the reader understands what's happening, and that the author understands what's happening. And there were a couple things that really drew me to the Chrononaut system, particularly. One was the idea of undone days. I think that's really it's a way to explore characters, right?
Mhm.
So like Mizuki knows that this day is not going through, and that anything that she says or does is going to exist only in Alfric's memory, and that is just like really rich for character stuff to happen in that, which I really liked. And then like yeah, there's this wider system, but the reader doesn't necessarily need to understand absolutely everything that's happening within it, and a lot of it there's just like narrative rules, right? Like if something goes terribly wrong, Alfric will be able to undo it, except in certain circumstances. And that rule is set up, and it takes away some of the tension from the dungeons a little bit. Some people said too much. I thought it was just right, but yeah, that was something I was very deliberate in thinking about. Like, what are the effects of this going to be on the narrative? How is it going to be understood? I'm mostly just like really like time travel, and I like it to be as concretely rules based as it can be.
Yeah. One other thing with the time travel in this used to be about dungeons is it's not super predictable. Like everything the next day doesn't happen exactly the same. And I feel like I often get annoyed at like in a time loop story like how exactly the same everything is. because people, just like humans, are not that good at doing things exactly the same way they did them in the past. Just like free throw shooting in basketball, for instance, like people are still out here missing. Like I can shoot free throws better than some pros. Like this is not like that easily of a learnable skill to do like exactly the same every time. Or like
Yeah.
same with just like having any conversation with someone. Even if they say the exact same things, it's going to be pretty hard to say the exact same things you did in the past the way you say them to get the exact same responses. And this kind of just like adding this chaos to it combined with just like having a limited number of resets to go through made it feel actually intense, sort of, rather than just free.
Yeah. I have a rant posted somewhere, but it's about that exact thing. I think that you need to conceive of time loops as being more like speedrunning, where it's like, yeah, if there are three speedrunning tricks that you need to do in a row, and you can do each of them 10% of the time, that means you get through that sequence 1 in 1,000 times. Are you really going to do this like 1,000 times to get like one success? Maybe for very specific things, but yeah, it's anything that you look up, like the best professional bowlers are not constantly throwing like 300 games. Part of that is because they change the like oil patterns or whatever, but it's just like there are things that are actually really really difficult, and you can't just like become perfect at things. There are limits to how good you can possibly get, and time loop stories tend to not respect that. They tend to just be like, oh yeah, I spent like 50 years and I am now able to hit a free throw every single time, and without fail, and I'm able to just do a bunch of things that should have like more effective like randomness or something. But yeah, that does bug me too. I keep meaning to write a time loop story. I have like a bunch of ideas that are all like piled up in a document somewhere, but I need to wait until I have something that gels them all together.
What would you say are like your kind of go-to top time travel story recommendations to people?
So at the very top of my list is Charles Stross wrote Palimpsest, which is it's a novella. I think that's one of my favorites. No, I think that is my favorite. I don't think there's anything that I liked more than that. I have this theory that time travel stories can be usefully divided into like two basic camps, where one camp is like really focused on the mechanical details of it, and then the other camp is more focused on like justifying a story element, often through like history. So like the Outlander books, where this woman like goes back in time and she falls in love with the like Scottish guy. That's like a love story, and it's about the contrast between the present and the future. And it is technically a time travel novel, but it's not doing the things that I like with it. It's not doing the idea exploration. Let me see. Primer, the movie Primer, is one of my favorites. Super super good. Sam Hughes of QNTM fame. He has a commentary that you can play with the movie that I enjoyed a lot. So he just like has a fan commentary where he talks about the movie as you watch the movie, which is like somehow really good. There is a romance novel called The Traveler's Wife, and they tried to make it into a movie and it wasn't very good, and they tried to make it in a show and the show was better but still not very good. I'm a huge fan of the book. I just think it's really well written and does a whole lot with the time travel concept, which I did not think it would going in. So it is a love story that anchors itself on these time travel mechanics and on the possibilities that are like available within that. So yeah, Palimpsest, Primer, Time Traveler's Wife. I think those are probably my three. Like, if you have not checked these out and you like time travel, you should go for them. Time Crimes is another one. Is a I think it was a Spanish language film. Um, there's got to be like others I'm missing, but I tend to watch like every time travel movie that comes out, and I tend to read them very heavily, so long as they're not like, oh, I just wanted to explore the idea of like being in different historical era. The Doomsday Book and To Say Nothing of the Dog are two more. Those are both by Connie Willis. I like those a lot, but those are more like historical era type things rather than oh, we are going through time and exploring the strange consequences to causality and stuff.
Yeah, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about rational fan fiction, and in particular, the Metropolitan Man,
Yeah.
since I've spent like basically like a good chunk of today and yesterday reading it, so I could kind of be done with it. But I guess the first thing I want to ask you about is, I would say that you've written like, a pretty good amount of fan fiction, and a lot of it is short to medium length stuff about, I would say like there's some characters you talk about that I feel like have not been. I feel like you write fan fiction about characters that in their normal narrative are just like not portrayed as being like especially interesting.
Yeah.
Like in the Metropolitan Man, a lot of it, which I wasn't expecting going in, is from Lois Lane's perspective, who honestly I can't say that I've read or watched a ton of Superman, but there are really not that many like traits that jump out about her. Um, and then there was also that story you wrote about like the guy on the Death Star who's just like kind
Oh
of
yeah.
this like
Yeah.
middle manager who's really stressed out about getting things done on time.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, like, is that something you look for when you're thinking about rational fan fiction projects? Like, are you trying to look for characters who kind of have a little bit more of a mundane backstory?
Um, I do a little bit. I think for me, it's just easy to find the interesting things about a person. Um, Lois Lane especially, like, is sort of patterned on Nellie Bly, who's a reporter in the like 1920s. I think the thing she was most famous for is she went and committed herself to like a mental institution undercover, and then like wrote a book about that. And I thought that's like, man, that is like really, really a ballsy thing to do because like you don't necessarily know. You need to like plan ahead a lot to like know that you're going to get out and to like do this reporting piece on that. So I've always had like an affection for Lois Lane, even though I think a lot of the time they don't do a very good job uh writing her. I think she's like a background character to Superman most of the time. Yeah, I guess I would say, to get back to the question, it's I don't necessarily look for like people who are underserved. I think that you can take any character and find interesting things in them. And I think for a lot of, especially like popular, I want to say nerd fiction, like superheroes and like Star Wars, people tend to focus on the characters whose most interesting thing is that they have power or that they are like special as assigned by the narrative. And I don't find that interesting. I clearly do find it interesting. If you read Worth the Candle, you'll say, "Oh, you don't find that interesting? You don't find the chosen one like thing that's like nothing to you? You wrote like this entire novel about chosen ones." And but yeah, I think if usually when I write like fanfic or like shorter stuff, it's because I had a something that caught me. And the Star Wars one, Instruments of Destruction, was almost entirely because I had been on a sort of project from hell at work. I was a software engineer at the time, and I was just like, man, like we are having these requirements like changed and piled on top of each other. There's this concept of definition of done, where like is like a wobbly thing. Like, what does it mean to be like actually done with the project? And if you are behind, you really start looking at whether or not you can change what it means to be done. Um, and so Gergerod, I think his name is was sort of like just the guy who would be like under all this pressure and stress. He shows up for I think two scenes maybe in all of Star Wars, and I was just like, what? Think about what that guy's life must be like to try to finish this project in this timeline. And that was really like interesting and special to me, and I was pretty sure that no one had ever done that before, which is also something that I look for. If I think if I think to myself when I'm writing, oh, probably like four or five other people have done this before, then I need to think to myself, okay, can I do it in a way that I will find better than what has come before? So yeah, I do like the minor characters. There's one things that I like most about Metropolitan Man is this idea that everyone has their own inner lives, and these are like real and valid, and that's one of the things I like about rational fiction. Like people should not just be an NPC that is sort of there to facilitate some part of the plot. They should be real, true people.
Mhm. One thing that I really liked about Metropolitan Man is that as a result of a lot of it being from Lois Lane's perspective, you actually are able to humanize Superman a lot more. Like, there's a lot of scenes where Lois Lane is just inner monologuing about all these traits about Clark Kent that are kind of pathetic and that she
Yeah,
doesn't like about him. And you kind of start to feel like defensive of Superman, where you're just like, oh, come on, like Clark Kent's not that bad.
yeah,
Whereas like in the normal story, you're just kind of like, oh yeah, he's like the superhuman that can do no wrong. But the interesting thing is like he's still pretty much acting like as he does in similarly perfectly to that he is in the comics and the movies. But you're just getting this commentary that is probably somewhat realistic from someone with Lois Lane's personality. I also kind of liked that Lois Lane is just like not super likable, but
yeah.
also she's very self-aware of like the ways in which she's not likable.
Hmm.
And I feel like these things are just kind of I think at least for me, these are both kind of challenges to I guess like the stereotypical idea of that kind of character. I feel like when you imagine Lois Lane, you're not imagining someone like that. But if you really start to think about it, like, okay, she's a reporter, she like has this dangerous job, she's like doing these things, like, it does kind of make sense. I was wondering, like, I kind of wish that I had known a little bit more about Lois Lane before reading it because I can't say that I've read like a ton. I think like really my only serious encounter with Superman stuff was like the really old Superman movie. What would you say was kind of your most thorough introduction to Lois Lane and got you interested in her as a character?
I think it probably started with the animated series. There's like a Superman animated series that was coming out on TV when I was growing up, I think. I think that she is a very interesting character, at least before the Superman reveal. Like in multiple continuities, because DC goes like and has a great number of continuities for, they really allow their writers to um just go in their own direction, and they're not worried that much. They have this like mythology approach to like superheroes and comic book storytelling. And in a lot of them, eventually it is revealed that Clark Kent is Superman, and Lois Lane just like really flattens as a character because of that. Which I've never liked when they do that. I think there needs to be some sort of inherent, I don't know. There needs to be an inherent tension between the two of them. She needs to have her suspicions. She needs to have ways in which they like grate against each other, like her and Clark Kent. I've also never really liked when like Lois Lane instantly falls in love with Superman like right away, which happens in I would say a fair amount of Superman stories, where she's just like, oh, he's like big and strong and he flies around and helps kittens and stuff. And I think that as a reporter, she's like too naive if she's just like, wow, I'm in love. And it's just not that interesting. So a lot of how I did Lois Lane was sort of in contrast to what I'd seen in the things that I was reading. um, I think Metropolitan Man probably owes its biggest inspiration in there's a series called Superman Red Sun, which is about if Superman landed in Russia instead of in Kansas, and so he becomes like the Soviet poster boy. I liked that a lot. It was very it was like playing with DC like canon and continuity and sort of like reinterpreting these characters in this different lens. And it's like, yeah, Superman, does he have like ideals, that are sort of independent of like his upbringing? Like probably not, right? Like he would be a communist if he like was raised by communist parents. And the so when I write fanfic, especially, I'm sort of looking at things that haven't been done before. I don't think that I think there's a lot of stuff that I was doing with Lois Lane that was not done by DC, but I don't 100% know if it's wholly original. It's just a lot of stuff that I was like trying to make this really realistic character. And I like that she's unlikable. I like that she is like pushing back against some of the tropes of Superman comics, especially the like she's not very understanding about being lied to, you know, which I thought that was like a really good trait for like a reporter to just be like, hey, you know, you can't just like deceive people and have that be okay. Like her whole career has been spent in the pursuit of truth. And especially for Clark, who's also his whole career is spent in the pursuit of truth, for him to be the one lying is like, yeah, I could see where that would be a thing that you would be like, that is actually not okay at all that this was done. And then obviously they can't like really talk about it that much because he's also like the most powerful man in the world. Um, so there's I really have an affection for Metropolitan Man. I did a reread of it a couple months ago because it was like the 10-year anniversary of it, and I wanted to reread it and see what I thought of it and the decisions I made. Um, but I think it still holds up. I think it's still good. It was also put out like just before Batman v Superman.
Mhm.
Oh,
So there have been like multiple different Superman iterations since that story came out, and I think it's interesting the ways in which the story might read differently depending on like what your frame of reference is for who Superman is. Very interested to see the James Gunn movie coming out soon. Like what his take on Superman is, and I'm like whether I can read anything as being a like in conversation with the Superman canon in the same way that I think Metropolitan Man is.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, I guess Superman really doesn't have like there isn't kind of like a really defining, like I think with Spider-Man and like Batman, there's been some pretty awesome movies that have been able to elevate the character, whereas I feel like Superman is still kind of this ideal that people are working towards,
Yeah,
narratively. So yeah, I am interested to see like if someone were to make like an amazing Superman movie. One of my favorite things about your fan fiction is I feel like you would have these like clarifying footnotes. Uh, and I feel like a lot of the time in this sort of work, this footnote is basically just this excuse to like go off and just write like a David Foster Wallace style footnote that's just like
yeah,
very long. But I feel like in this case, it was kind of just like more of the vibe of like you're reading some kind of textbook and there's just like a little annotation to just like clarify this one thing. I wanted to read one example from the uh the Frozen fanfic he wrote, just A Bluer
oh
Shade
yeah,
of White, where you said, the question of when Frozen takes place is a fairly interesting one, but for this fic, it's assumed that it takes place sometime between the 1750s and 1850s. It at the least postdates the invention of the sandwich, mentioned the song Love's an Open Door. Also, the giant snow golem is named Marshmallow, and the modern marshmallow wasn't invented until the 1800s, when it became the snack we know and love today, and actually became white instead of being made with oats. The lack of firearms in favor of crossbows is a little curious given that timeline, but whatever.
yeah,
In the example of the textbook, I feel like there are a lot of times where someone will just like clarify something in the margin notes, and like 90% of people will just be like, okay. But a lot of the time I'm just like, oh thanks. I actually did like to have that clarified. Thank you.
yeah,
I felt that way like a couple times.
yeah. I think one of my favorite ones in Metropolitan Man was it's like briefly mentioned that there were orphan trains, which was this practice where they would like put a bunch of orphans from the cities on trains and just like send them out to the countryside to like be picked up by farmers to like just raise as their own and have farm labor. This is sort of like and I felt it was like important to put in a footnote. Yes, this is like a real thing. I did not make up orphan trains. This is like a part of American history that is like real and important, and it actually happened. And probably you've never heard of it before, but I didn't. This is like this is not my imagination here. This is like a real thing. I really love the footnote. Generally, I wish there were better ways to do it, like on the web. I wish, like in a book, like every page you just like go to the bottom of it. But yeah, I read a lot of Terry Pratchett when I was younger, and he goes hard on the footnotes. They're usually for comic effect, but I'm just like, yeah, people want to know about this stuff, and I don't want to include like a very long thing about orphan trains in the actual text itself. I should get back to doing more footnotes. I haven't done a footnote in a hot minute.
Yeah, it is definitely rough on a web page that you kind of have to do them at the end of the chapter effectively instead of the end of the page, or have them interrupt the text in some awkward way.
One thing I did want to talk about is your pen name, for some people who don't know, was cthuluraejepsen. Now, uh, I am a really big cthuluraejepsen fan, so much so that I actually have an Instagram account called cthuluraejepsen. So I was wondering, like, are you a really big cthuluraejepsen fan, or was it more just kind of like a handle that you thought was cool?
It was a handle I thought was cool, was most of it. Like I'm not I would call myself like a moderate fan,
Moderate
but
fan.
I think it's just the specific concept, the specific funniness, the like stupidity of those two things combined. I was like, yeah, this is like just stupid enough. And also, I was going into it like I'm like I want something low pressure, and I thought that that particular username was like people would read it and they'd be like, oh, okay, I can like set my expectations for what this guy's humor is going to be like. I can. I don't know. It's a very dumb name that I appreciated for its stupidity.
Carly Jepsen really is like a memorable name. You know, like
Yeah,
I think there are often people who I encounter who really have kind of forgotten about Call Me Maybe, but like they'll hear Carly Jepsen and they're just like, ah man, like I've heard that somewhere. Like is that the person that made Friday? Like what
yeah.
is that again? I'm like, yeah, I don't know. I don't even I think that's her real name. Um all right. Well, I think that's a pretty good time to wrap things up. So, as a final note, is there any piece of short fiction that you would like to recommend?
Okay, I have one short story. I have one short story to recommend, which is Eager Readers in Your Area. Is a short story that I wrote as a companion piece to an essay I'd written on artificial intelligence. And the premise of it is that at a certain point, AI fiction becomes readable and sort of swamps or outcompetes human authors. And suddenly, authors are just in desperate competition for who's going to get the readers. And so it's like a little eager readers in your area is like a take on hot singles in your area. It's like people who will read your stuff and like you should click our links so you can get a reader. That's a pretty short story. I'm very fond of it and think it says a lot of stuff about like sci-fi stuff that's not as sci-fi anymore.
Yeah, actually, this I think this was my favorite work of yours that I read over the past few days. I really
Yeah,
enjoyed this.
yeah.
Um, and also, if there's anything else you'd like to plug, you can feel free to share that as well.
I will be finishing book 5 of Thresholder in the near future, hopefully. I think that has been a fun thing to write and a fun thing to read. My next series will be Doomsday Pivot, which is about a startup company going through a system apocalypse. Very like webfic heavy, but also I've had a lot of experience with people in Silicon Valley and in part of the startup crowd, so I read that when it comes out, I guess.
All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on the pod, and we will see you all in a couple weeks.
Welcome back. So, any thoughts on the episode, Kevin?
Yeah, I think this episode was probably the least stressful one that we've done in a while, which is kind of interesting considering that Alexander Wales is probably one of the most famous guests that we've had on. But I think that he was more, I guess, a sort of person that we're familiar with. And by that I mean kind of just like rationalist adjacent in web fiction, and we kind of knew a lot of the same. We had a lot of the same kinds of vocabulary to talk about things. There were times in the episode where I was a little bit like, okay, maybe we should have explained this like rationalisty or web fictiony thing a bit more to the audience, but to be completely honest, I think that would have taken far too much time. And so maybe it's better that we just went straight to talking about it. But yeah, I was wondering, what were your thoughts on it?
Definitely a fun one. I was like a bit stressed going in because I mean I'd read a bit more of his work, so I was kind of like leading at least the beginning portion of the episode. But yeah, like as you said, kind of going through it was pretty easy. He was pretty used to being a podcast guest. Like he kind of had clearly done it before, and there are a few times which was pretty nice where I don't know he talked about something for a while and then kind of like sort of left it off at a point. Noticed like me and Kevin weren't like jumping to immediately have to like say respond to something with that, and then kept going a little bit. And then it was like a more clear point where we could jump off from. Uh, and yeah, that was pretty nice because I feel like I could like jump in if I had something to say, but like if I didn't, then you would kind of keep going. It was also just really cool to talk to him specifically about This Used to Be About Dungeons, because that's one of my favorite web fiction books, and I feel like it's a really unique one. I would definitely recommend to anyone. Yeah, overall I think went pretty smoothly. Solid episode.
I guess I kind of had a similar experience with you in the Gauchum episode, in that I was really grinding out the Metropolitan Man for the 24 hours before the episode, and like even right before the episode, I was just like on the last chapter. I was like, oh, I don't know if I'm gonna finish, and so it was kind of cool to have the book be super fresh and then be able to talk about things immediately. And also, The Metropolitan Man was just a book that I had vaguely been wanting to read for a while, but I didn't actually know that he wrote it. And also, the Star Wars story that we briefly talked about was something I had read in the past. Also, was not aware that it was by him. So there's a little bit of unexpected coincidence with that. Something I was actually thinking about is, I don't even know if I can put this into words, but there's a certain kind of like rationalist prose, but isn't I think like the stereotypical rationalist prose is someone explaining something in like a sort of like precocious and or slightly condescending way, like especially in Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. But I feel like there's this other type of rationalisty prose that is kind of better, where the person is kind of talking to you as though you're like in on the joke, sort of. Like, I think I get this especially in The Flower That Bloomed Nowhere, where they're like kind of explaining something to you, but it sort of has the subtext of like, ah, yeah, like you know what I'm talking about. But like sometimes you just like don't, but you feel like comforted that they thought that you would know. Do you know what I'm talking about, or like not really?
Yeah. No. I get what you're saying. I'm trying to think of there was one part of Worth the Candle where I feel like he really did this. Never mind. It's not too important. Uh, but anyway, yeah, I feel like he definitely does that a good amount in his writing. Yeah, so changing topics a bit here, but you just recently wrote this article about the science fiction scene in China, and particularly comparing it to Golden Age sci-fi. So yeah, any thoughts on that?
I think that after reading the Three Body Problem series, I thought that I was wondering like what inspired this book series, because there were people that said that it was maybe in some ways similar to past sci-fi works, but I couldn't really think of any recent sci-fi books that it could have been inspired by. And then I looked to see who Cixin Liu's main inspiration was, and this actually turned out to be Arthur C. Clarke. And Arthur C. Clarke is a very influential sci-fi author from the Golden Age, but he's actually like not really that popular amongst modern sci-fi fans in America, I would say. People know who he is, but I would say I've heard more about him from my dad specifically than other fans of sci-fi that are my age. And I would say that this is pretty normal. But I think this was interesting to me because in my head, I was almost just like, okay, so I wonder if Cixin Liu is just like, okay, yeah, the stuff in the middle, like, I don't really care about that as much. I want to like take inspiration more from the source. And so I talked to a couple more Chinese people after this just to get a sense of what the Chinese sci-fi scene was like, because I was just curious what this parallel non-English sci-fi scene is doing. And they're pretty similar in a lot of ways, but I will say that one pretty noticeable difference is that people really liked Arthur C. Clarke, and he was still one of the most popular and beloved sci-fi authors there, which I thought was kind of surprising in light of how science fiction has changed since then. Because I think that a lot of Arthur C. Clarke and Asimov's work are considered to have been really good and important at their time for what they did, but the genre has kind of evolved by adding like all of this like social commentary and developing these tropes and becoming more character driven. But I did kind of agree that there was a bit of a like some sauce that has been lost since the golden age. Like I think it's unfair to say that current science fiction is outperforming golden age science fiction in every respect, even though I would say in most ways it's probably better. And I was trying to figure out what that is. And my conclusion was that this is probably just, I guess, a combination of having some degree of optimism and some degree of reverence for science and technology in general. Because I would say that a pretty common theme of science fiction today, especially in the West, is the idea that technology is something to be feared or something that we shouldn't really have a ton of faith in, and that science is not really this like platonic ideal that we should aspire towards, but more like a tool that we must wield carefully to achieve a great end. Whereas I think a lot of golden age sci-fi and Chinese sci-fi in particular is more like science is the end. You know, it's just pretty cool. I think that the pretty obvious criticism that I would expect people to come in with for this article is something along the lines of like, oh, well, you know, it's important that we don't have blind optimism in technology. Or like, well, actually, people are doing some amount of scientific and technological innovation today that's pretty impressive. Like, don't you know? And I could see why you might have that criticism coming in at the article with like really zoomed out level. But that was not really the point I was trying to make. Like, I wouldn't say that Golden Age sci-fi or Chinese sci-fi is characterized with a reckless embrace of technology. It's more just characterized by a faith that actually it can just be good in the end. I think it's more about faith in science than anything else. It's not about like, oh yes, I am 100% confidently sure this will confidently work and I have no reservations. It's that you just have some level of faith that it'll work out in the end, and you also have faith in science as this noble ideal that is worthy of being pursued, independently of what utility it will produce for the world or whatever. And I think that while it is true that people are innovating in science fiction, even scientifically, I think there's less people that are innovating from the perspective of, oh, yes, we are like doing science because science is a noble pursuit in itself and not just because it leads to other useful things.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's definitely fair. One other thing you touch on in the article, which I feel like was interesting, is that in China, the sci-fi community and stuff is just like it's much younger and much more connected to like universities and actual scientific research that's happening. And this sort of used to be the case in America as well in the golden age. It does feel almost inevitable that you would get kind of more of a optimistic uh, view of science, being someone near all these like exciting cutting edge scientific projects. It feels like more likely you'd want to write a story kind of with that energy instilled in it. Where in America now, like sci-fi is, I don't know, a bit older and is a bit, it's not very connected to like actual scientific research. Even though like this is not to say like I think sci-fi writers are like still very knowledgeable about science, like in general, and like most of the time like get the science right pretty well, but they're often not like writing like while super connected to some scientific project. And I feel like this can take some like natural enthusiasm out of the work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's increasingly rare for sci-fi writers to actually be scientists. I think Adrian Tchaikovsky was kind of unusual in that regard. And I mean, even people like Andy Weir and Ted Chiang, like these people are the science they're doing isn't I don't know. With Andy Weir in particular, right? He's just like a software engineer. I kind of doubt that like this is the scientific engine that is powering his writing and like The Martian and stuff. But I guess like yeah, I think it was kind of a bummer to learn that sci-fi clubs have really died off. Like one thing that I was doing to confirm this is I went through the entire list of US News top 50 public universities in the United States and just like went to each one and tried to figure out if they still had a sci-fi club. And there were a couple times where I would run into one where the sci-fi club had just recently died to the point where, like, if I had gone to that university and decided to join that club, it like might not have died because there just wasn't quite the critical mass. So like, there was this one time where I joined. I think it was like at Purdue. I like dropped into their Discord to see if this club was like still a thing that was existing, and like nobody had sent a message in the Discord for like 2 years, even though it had been like a pretty active Discord since then. And so I just like jumped in, and someone's just like, "Are you a Fed?" And then I just like didn't say anything. I think that there was also a club that had been like there were a couple clubs that had been like rebranded where like before they were like just sci-fi clubs, then they kind of became like more general sci-fi clubs. Then there was one that actually just became like a board game club, but like we do like sci-fi stuff sometimes too, right? But one thing I've been thinking about for a while when talking to my dad and my older relatives and stuff is I feel like there's kind of a lot more outlets for being nerdy than there were in the past. Like, I think previously, if you were just like a nerd or a geek, pretty much there were like, this was such a small, like a marginalized subculture that you kind of just had to like tolerate everyone else's nerdy interests, if that makes sense. Like, there was the one club of people who like did geeky stuff, and you kind of just did all the geeky stuff. Whereas nowadays, I feel like people who are just like really into anime or something, and people who are really into board games just don't really have to have much contact with each other as a result of how these subcultures have evolved. And so, like, as a result, I think that like studying sci-fi as like a specific thing is sort of like less compelling when you're not like all bound together by shared geekiness, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I also feel like because being a nerd is just much less stigmatized than it used to be, you can just kind of be a nerd in like not nerdy areas. Like I would say like you, for example, are pretty nerdy about pop music. But like this is just like not a way you could like be a nerd in the past, I feel like, really, and like have any sort of like community or connection to other people in this way, right? But like because that's like just something you can do, and you can kind of do that for anything. Like you can be like tons of people are like nerds about any sport, right? Like if you were a nerd about a sport, you were like a nerd, and that was like pretty different from the normal sports fan, where like nowadays that's like less the case. Like I feel like you can just like be more a part of kind of mainstream communities, but like still like being a nerd in your interaction with those communities. um so then one other thing is we both wrote our book reviews for the two Adrian Tchaikovsky novels nominated for the Hugo Awards, so Alien Clay and Service Model. So starting with Alien Clay, let's say, what were your thoughts about this book?
I feel like we both had more thoughts than I was expecting, just based on what we said about the short stories. We kind of wrote a lot.
It is a book instead of a short
Yeah,
story.
it is a book, but yeah, I really liked this book. Yeah, I really liked this book a lot. I think that I actually liked it more going back. I think that when you were talking about some of your criticisms of it, which we'll get into, I was sort of like, yeah, at times like the prose was sort of like overly colloquial, and that kind of took me out of it. And like, I don't know, it wasn't really like outstanding in this regard. But I think that there were also a few times that I noticed on a reread when I was thinking of things to say about it that were just kind of awesome, like awesome and epic. Like there was this one pass in particular that I remembered being good, but I didn't remember being like super good, which is from the very beginning of the book. And this is basically a scene where these people are just like coming in on this very cheap rocket and getting like dropped down onto Kiln. And like the passage is, let me tell you what you're waking up into. Actual hell. The roaring of colossal structural damage, the ship breaks up all around you. The jostling jolts, the little translucent bubble of plastic you're traveling in is jarred loose and begins to tumble. A cacophony of vibration coming through the curved surface to you. The death throws the vessel which has carried you all this way out into the void and is now fragmenting. There's a world below that you know nothing about, not in your head right then, and above you are only the killing fields of space. The fact there's a below and an above shows the planet's already won that particular battle over your soul and you're falling. The oldest fear of monkey humanity, the one which makes a baby's rubbery hands clench without thought. Such a fall from grace as never mankind nor monkey imagined. And I was just like, man, he really cooked with that one. I gotta say.
That's a really good passage. The opening of the book is like actually just fantastic. Like the first 15 pages or so, very, very good.
But yeah, I mean, I just really have a thing for books that kind of like books and stories that fit together very neatly. Like it is very obvious what the telos of like all of these parts of the book are. And I think Alien Clay did that very well. And as a result, like there's only so much I can be critical of the book. I thought it was a very enjoyable read.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I kind of, to some extent, like, I read your review and just like I agree on some level with all the things you said, and just like really wish this was my experience reading this book. Because on an idea level, I thought the book was fantastic. And I thought like the biology was great. I thought the comparisons between the ecosystem of Kiln and kind of the political structure were really cool. I thought like the revolutionary stuff was really well done. But I thought that there were just some, in my opinion, like kind of there are a few like structural flaws here that I'm just like, what are you doing? Like, why? It feels so unnecessary. Specifically, I feel like I don't know. Basically, in my opinion, the what should have been like the climax of the book just got kind of like completely spoiled. It almost felt like when I was maybe like 10, I was reading through all the Harry Potter books, right? And I was on like the 6th book, the Half-Blood Prince, and I just started, and I was talking to a friend about it, and then they were just like, is that the one where Dumbledore dies? And I was just like, fuck you, actually, like, fuck you. And, and I just like didn't like the book nearly as much as a result. But yeah, reading Alien Clay, I felt like this was done to be in the book by the author. Where I just like read this part and I was just like, why are we fast forwarding through time in this situation? It just felt kind of insane. And like I sort of get like it's not to say that I don't get like the reason for like why this was done to some extent. There is sort of like a big reveal kind of that happens that is like saved for the end of the book as a result of this structure. But I think the big reveal is like made blatantly obvious, like what happens as a result of just like events occurring after it, like necessitating its existence. And then so by the time it came around, I was just like, wow, this would have been like the best part of the book if I didn't already know everything that would have happened. I would have been like so emotionally invested, but instead I'm just not. I didn't think overall that was just like my biggest criticism of the book. It felt like there were times where things just like made me less invested than I could have been. Because yeah, it was like mainly the structural thing, and then also the prose also just like took me out a few times where it was just like the intensity of a scene would be kind of robbed by just like some kind of like witty joke that was like sort of funny but was also just broke the tension enough that like I didn't feel tension anymore when reading, and I like wish I did. And yeah, but I still enjoyed the book, and looking back on it, like I agree. Thinking back on it, it's better because like reading a specific passage or stuff is like, yeah, it was like mainly the reading experience itself that felt like not quite what I would have hoped.
So. I mean, one thing I didn't really talk about as much in my review is that I actually did also like the characters in the book a fair bit. Like I thought that some of the exchanges between the main character and the commandant was that his
Commandant?
name? Commandant,
yeah,
were like pretty cool. And I also just thought the camaraderie between all of the revolutionaries was just like really cool, and seeing how it develops over time, like through the book. Like at the beginning, they're kind of just like, ah, yeah, like fuck this like professor guy, but like as it goes on, they're kind of just like, they're all on the grind, they're all on the revolutionary grind. I think like while I do sort of agree that this ordering wants some of the emotional impact of the climax, I also think that like the vibe like immediately when they come back and you're just like not sure what happened is like kind of cool. They're just like all like super ascended. You're just like, wow, like I wonder what happened to them. I mean, I think
I feel
that
like I already knew what happened to them at that point, but maybe I was just cooking.
yeah, I mean, I think that honestly, like how the book is meant to be, right, is you're just not supposed to know what happened, right?
Mhm.
And in that particular case, then like you can see how it would like I feel like
Yeah, yeah.
what I feel like what you would want actually if like the narrative is to be told as intended is just like a cut of this book that's like less figure outable. And then you would actually get the desired effect as opposed
Yeah,
to like a
yeah.
linear edit. Like,
Uh,
how much do you think you would enjoy the book if it was like you didn't know what the reveal was?
I think I would a bit more, but I think I just wanted a linear edit. I
Uh-huh.
didn't want to know. I didn't want it like spoiled, like who lived, who died, like that type of thing.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. But I mean, I agree. I would obviously like that more than what I had. But yeah, yeah, I did really like. I mean, particularly the commandant, I thought was like a great character, and like the conversations between him and our main character. 'Cause as I was saying, I found like a lot of other things that happened in the book like less tense than they maybe should have been. So as a result, like these conversations were like by far like the most on the edge of my seat as I was like reading the book at any point. Like they were the most like intense kind of gripping scenes for me because he was really like it felt like you didn't know what he was gonna do next. Because he had like he's like flip floppy between this like disgust and admiration for our like protagonist and like wanting to get in his good graces but also like wanting him to show that like he has complete domination and authority over him and this just like led to some really interesting interactions where really didn't know what he was going to do next.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So moving on to service model, I think we're like more in agreement on this one, but yeah, what are your thoughts on this book?
Yeah, so I think part of this reading experience is honestly altered a bit by like, you saying that you did not particularly like this book. But I think as a result, like at the very beginning of the book, I was like, man, this book's pretty good. Like Gordon's kind of tweaking. And I think I probably would have maintained that opinion if it was just like shorter and didn't take itself quite as seriously. I think that if this book was more of like a lighthearted novella that was like 100 something pages and just kind of like ends in some like sort of comical fashion when they get to the library, then I feel like I just feel like, yeah, this is a pretty good book. But I think as a result of trying to be like a more serious novel, it kind of suffers. Like once you kind of get to some more real climaxed emotional stakes, there's like a bit of tonal whiplash, and you're just like, oh wait, like I'm actually supposed to care about this. And I think it also makes it harder to cope with the fact that there is no explanation given at all for the robot's sentience. And this is just kind of bothersome if you think about it too much. And I think that the first half of the novel kind of gives you enough, it kind of directs your attention away from like thinking about this as a serious problem. You're just kind of like, well, this isn't like trying to be especially hard. Like it's kind of just like what I was kind of able to like look past it. But once sort of more serious things started to happen in the novel and they started to grapple with the apocalypse in a more direct way, I was like, okay, well, now I don't know. Now I'm thinking about this and I don't think that this is actually making a ton of sense.
Yeah. I think I was kind of right about this in my review, and I think the sentience was like meant to be like ambiguous, kind of just like it was meant to be this big question you're asking as you're reading, like, is Uncharles sentient? Are these other robots sentient or not? Like, I can't really tell. But I feel like there were a few things that just like made it kind of clear that like basically it was pretty common for the robots to sort of like maliciously comply in some ways, and it was clear that there was like something that they had some like directive like task list which limits the actual things they can do, and there's something they want to do, and then they want to like do things that get as close to that thing they want to do as possible. Which like clearly shows an amount of like will and sentience. And yeah, this was just never explained. And yeah, kind of annoyed me.
I actually want to talk a bit more at length about the footnote that I left in this review, where when I was reading the book, there's this character called the Wonk that is pretty obviously just like a human, you know, and Uncharles treats them as a robot. That's just kind of weird, but like they're pretty obviously a human. But there's a certain point in the book where Uncharles is imagining the Wonk even though they're not in the scene. And this part of the book really confused me a lot. I'm not entirely sure like why this scene was necessary, but it got me thinking like, man, what if the Wonk was like never real? Like that would be kind of interesting, wouldn't it be? Because like then I was thinking like maybe the way that Uncharles is like conceiving of his own sentience is of like there is this like human that is talking to me and influencing me, and this is where the sentience is coming from. In a similar way to like in season 1 of Westworld, it's revealed that these artificial intelligences are sentient because they kind of hear these whispers in their mind that are like talking back to them, and the prerequisite for sentience is to be able to have like a dialogue with your inner thoughts. And I was just like, oh shit, like what if the reveal is going to be that the Wonk is just like actually how the process of sentience comes to arise in these robots? Like they start to see a human, and there's like no humans left in the world, period. But like they kind of just like see these humans, which is the way that they like progress to sentience. I'm like, ah, wow, like this is about to be like a banger reveal. That did not happen. I thought it'd been pretty cool if that happened though.
Yeah. Yeah, that would have been cool. I think it could have worked.
Because that would be how you could actually elevate the stakes of the novel, you know, or make it become more serious. It's like, oh shit, like, why can't Uncharles figure out that the Wonk is just like literally a human? It's because like the Wonk is literally a human, but also literally not real and in Uncharles's brain. And it's like, why is like, you know, I think just a lot of stuff would just kind of like make sense. Oh yeah, maybe these other robots are like maliciously complying because they have some like human that's influencing them as well. I think it would get you to kind of like reshift your perspective on the novel an appropriate amount.
Yeah. Yeah, so then one other thing about this book is it was like structured kind of in a very repetitive way, like on purpose. To be clear, I think this is definitely not an accident. But like it would basically be like Uncharles and the Wonk would just like show up at some new location. Uncharles like wants a job, he wants purpose, and it's like clearly like not gonna work out in some way. And then like shit happens, and then they go off to a new location. All right. And I feel like this structure is just really reliant on these settings hitting, kinda. Because if you're gonna have your characters have like basically the same reaction and like do the same things like in very broad general strokes, you just like need the actual like visceral things that are happening to be really interesting and the setting to be really cool. And I feel like this did happen a few times. Like specifically the library I thought was fantastic and the library segment was great. And if it just like every one of the settings they interacted with was just like as cool as the library, I think I would have just like liked this book a lot. Like I feel like the structure did kind of work. I mean, could have worked. But it was also just like I do kind of respect it because it was like a really gutsy structure to go for a novel. I feel like Adrian Tchaikovsky writing this novel is kind of just like, yeah, I'm gonna have this be like repetitive and tedious, and it's gonna be great. And I respect that.
I actually did kind of like all the settings. Well, okay, I wasn't a huge fan of like the post-apocalyptic ones, but like I kind of liked the like diagnostics services place.
Diagnostic Services was the other one I liked.
And like I like the farm as well. I thought the farm was kind of like a cool vibe. And I like the library as well. The ones after I wasn't as much of a fan of, but
yeah. I mean, I didn't super like the farm. I thought it was okay. I didn't love the starting setting, I guess. The manor house.
I have really enjoyed the reading experience of the first half of this novel. I will
Mhm.
say. It just like hasn't aged super well in my mind. I think it's very hard for me to tell. Like, I don't really have much. I don't put much stock into like my moment to moment reading experience unless it's like really really good because I feel like it's just so like mood dependent. I think that in partially I enjoyed the second half of Service Model less because it didn't really resolve in a way that I wanted to, but partially I was just like way more tired and in a worse mood. I just did not enjoy it as much as a result. Whereas like in the first half of the book I was like, yay, happy, yay, reading. And so as a result, I think it's kind of hard for me to fully assess a book until like kind of some time has passed and I've allowed it to really crystallize in my mind. And Alien Clay still feels really good to me, whereas Service Model is increasingly like, yeah, well, I don't really know about this book. I mean, yeah. Do you have any final thoughts on the books in general?
I mean, yeah, definitely. Uh, Even though I think combined I give them both somewhat middling scores, I guess. I definitely like Alien Clay a fair amount more. And I think like Alien Clay will continue to be a book I kind of think back on from time to time. Where I don't know if Service Model will.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Despite me kind of shitting on Service Model, I still honestly expect to enjoy Service Model more than most of the rest of the books, if not all of them. And even though Gordon and other people have spoken quite highly of Tainted Cup, I do not think I'm going to enjoy it more than Alien Clay. And so I think that I can probably say that Alien Clay will be my top pick in general, although, it remains to be seen. But I am also just pretty interested in what Adrian Tchaikovsky will write in the future. And I would definitely consider picking up Children of Ruin, Children of Memory, maybe even like Shadows of the Apt or something.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, I think that's a pretty good place to wrap things up. So Kevin, do you have any short fiction recommendation?
Yeah, I think a pretty fitting recommendation right now would be the story Human Resources, which is Adrian Tchaikovsky's prequel to Service Model. I think the story was pretty good. I actually read it before Service Model, and I actually think it does a better job of establishing the correct tone for this universe. It is both quite lighthearted and absurd and funny, but also kind of like deeply disturbing the way in which society has been turned over to the robots. And I think that was kind of the intended effect. Um, I would definitely recommend this story just as like a I don't know, like I think almost like as a standalone even it can be pretty interesting to imagine like what sort of a world like what that might be.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you all in a couple of weeks.